In 1988, the Reagan administration declared Mandela's African National Congress to be one of the world's most notorious terrorist groups. It's 1988, while it described Renamo in Mozambique merely as an indigenous insurgent group. That was after it had just killed about 100,000 people, according to the State Department, with, of course, US-backed African support. Thatcher's record was similar, or maybe worse, but most of this was in secret. There was just too much popular opposition. And the popular opposition made a difference. There was a very significant anti-apartheid movement decades after the global decision at the Security Council to bring apartheid to an end. In 1965, boycotts and other measures would not have been effective. 20 years later, they were effective, but that was after the groundwork had been laid by activist, educational, and organizing efforts, including within the powerful states, which is what matters in an ugly world. Well, in the case of Israel-Palestine, the groundwork has not been laid. The quotes that I just gave are perfectly representative examples. You can fill them out in books. The kind of popular measures that were effective against apartheid by the late 1980s are not only ineffective in the case of Israel-Palestine today, but in fact sometimes backfire, harming the victims. We've seen that over and over. And it's going to continue until the organizing and educational efforts make real progress. It's not just the United States. The European Union is hardly different. So, for example, the European Union does not bar arms deliveries to Israel. It joined the United States in vicious punishment of Palestinians because they committed the grave crime of voting the wrong way in a free election. And there was very little internal protest in Europe. Populations support the international consensus, but they don't react when their governments undermine any hope for its realization. Well, in the coming weeks and the longer term, there's plenty of educational and organizational activity that will have to be carried out among an American population that happens to be largely receptive, though deluged with propaganda and deceit. And it's not going to be easy. It's never been easy, but much harder tasks have been accomplished with dedicated and persistent effort.
MIT professor Noam Chomsky speaking recently in Boston at a conference called The Apartheid Paradigm in Palestine-Israel, sponsored by the Palestinian Christian organization Sabeel. If you'd like a copy of today's show, you can go to our website at democracynow.org. The keynote speaker at the conference was the former South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He was an inspirational leader in the South African fight against apartheid, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1984, today continuing to speak out around the globe for peace and justice. In 2006, the Israeli government blocked Tutu from leading a UN delegation into Gaza. He was investigating the killing of 19 Palestinians in Gaza. Tutu made headlines recently when the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, canceled an invitation for him to speak at the school next spring. The president of the university, the Reverend Dennis Deese, revoked the invitation over Tutu's criticism of Israeli policy in the occupied territories. Deese also fired Chris Tofolo as head of the university's Peace and Justice program, though she remains a professor at the university. She had supported the invitation to Tutu. After a vocal public outcry from students and faculty, Deese apologized to Tutu and invited him back to speak at the university. Tutu began his speech at the historic Old South Church in Boston by addressing the issue.
As you probably know, someone put out a rather distorted version of what I said here in 2002. And on the basis of that, the president of St. Thomas University decided I shouldn't visit his campus. It is good that he has since reversed this decision. and I want to commend him very warmly for his courage in admitting publicly that he was wrong. It is never easy to do that. I have received the President's invitation in which he makes a very handsome apology, which I have accepted. And I am happy to accept his invitation, provided it can be fitted into my schedule, and if Professor Toffolo is reinstated with no adverse comments in her academic file arising from this unfortunate episode. I thank God for my Hebrew antecedents. I thank God that I too am a descendant of Abraham. I give thanks to God for the gift of the Holy Scriptures, made up substantially of the Hebrew Scriptures, forming what we conventionally refer to as our Old Testament. Even our New Testament, which would be distinctively Christian, is incomprehensible without taking its Jewish setting seriously. For instance, the name Jesus is Greek for Joshua, the one who led God's people into the promised land. And the word Christ is anointed one, in Hebrew, Messiah, whose coming was predicted in the Jewish scriptures and who was longed for so poignantly by the Jews. I tell you nothing you do not already know. I refer to it only to assert that spiritually I am of Hebrew descent. That legacy has been of crucial importance for me in our struggle against apartheid. At the height of the struggle, when apartheid's repression was at its most vicious, and it seemed indeed as if the apartheid rulers were firmly ensconced in power, when they had all but knocked out the stuffing of their opponents, and they were strutting the stage as invincible cocks of the walk, then we turned to the inspiration of our Hebrew tradition and antecedents. We were able to revive and sustain our people's hope for their vindication and the ultimate triumph of good over evil, of freedom over injustice and oppression by our references to our biblical traditions. It was often quite exhilarating. I remember once when there had been a massacre in one of our townships, which had been instigated by a sinister third force linked to the apartheid security apparatus. Our bishops, quite unusually, suspended a session of Episcopal Synod so that, as in the case of an Ezekiel who sat side by side with stunned exiles, so we would be a ministry of presence. And we held a service in one of our ghetto township churches. The people were stunned, devastated by the naked violence of that massacre. I preached, and I used Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 9. God's words which Yahweh asked Moses to announce to the children of Israel. And I said to our people gathered there, our God is not deaf. Our God has heard our cries. Our God is not stupid. Our God knows our suffering. Our God is not blind. God has seen and sees our pain and anguish. And yes, our God will come down and set us free. Yes, our God will come down to open the prison doors and lead our leaders from prison and lead our leaders back from exile. For we had learned from our Jewish tradition that God, our God, is notoriously biased, forever taking the side of the weak, the oppressed, the downtrodden, against the kings and the powerful oppressors. Our God had been made first in the Bible story, not in a sanctuary. Our God was made first in the mundane world of politics. Our God taking the side of a rebel of slaves against the mighty Pharaoh. God, we said to our people, is not neutral. God sided with Uriah the Hittite against his own favorite, King David, after David's adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah. Thou art the man. Anywhere else, the king could have got away with both actions, but not in Israel. It really seemed as if the Jewish scriptures were written specifically for us. The story of Naboth's vineyard and King Ahab and Jezebel being confronted on Yahweh's behalf by Elijah seemed to have been written especially with our situation in mind, where blacks, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly, were shipped in their millions, like so many pawns in population removal schemes, and dumped in poverty-stricken Bantustan homelands, hardly able to eke out a living, cut off from the more affluent so-called white South Africa.
Former South African Archbishop, Nobel laureate Desmond Tutu, giving a speech at the Old South Church in Boston. We'll return to the conclusion of his address in a minute.
ينحني ويصلي لإله في العيون العسلية بين ردة وعيوني بندقية والذي يعرف ردة ينحني ويصلي لإله في العيون العسلية.
Lebanese musician Marcel Khalifa, the song Rita and the Rifle. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting on over 500 stations around the country on Pacifica and NPR and low-power FM and college and community radio stations, as well as public access TV and PBS TV stations and both TV satellite networks. Dish Network Channel 9415, Free Speech TV, 9410 Link TV, and on DirecTV Channel 375. And we're video and audio podcasting at democracynow.org. As we return to the conclusion of the address of the former South African African Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who's speaking at the Old South Church in Boston, speaking at a conference sponsored by the Palestinian Christian organization Sabeel. Nobel Peace Laureate Tutu spoke about his struggle against the apartheid government in South Africa as a religious leader.
It was exhilarating